Hey everybody, we are teaching tilt brush, and this particular tilt brush is all about realistic paintings. We've done cartoon and anime style, that type of thing. This time we're going to look at how to make a painting feel a little more realistic, maybe even photorealistic if we're willing to take the time to go into that kind of detail. A lot of it's going to depend on the lighting and the brushes you use, because not all brushes are going to respond to the lighting. One of the things that helps us feel like an object is real is the way it responds to light and shadow. So I'm going to leave this up here, and as I move the lighting around, you can see how the texture, the lighting and the shadow really helps this dressmaker's dummy feel like it's actually here in the room with me, even though it's just in tilt brush. In the cartoon episode, we saw how tools like the toon give you a nice bright color and solid line. But even though this toon has its own highlight and shadow, you'll notice that highlight and shadow has nothing to do with the highlight and shadow in the rest of the painting. And the whole point of a realistic painting is everything is on the same plane. Everything's in the same universe. If the lighting isn't exactly the same, even if the viewer isn't consciously aware of it, that difference in lighting is enough to trigger them to realize it's not really together, it's not a photograph, it's been something put together on the computer. So what we're going to do is look at which tools do work better with these types of styles. As far as our lines go, the Icing Tool, you'll notice, it actually does have, let's get a little closer to it, a nice texture that responds to the lighting. So you can see it's got this rough texture as part of the tool, and as I change the lighting, the highlight and the texture changes with it. So that way it actually feels like it's in the same world as this dressmaker's dummy. Everything about it reflects and shadows in the same way. That is a real important cue for the human eye and brain to put them together. Any of the heavily textured brushes have that. So for example, if I go into our thick paint, a nice stroke of thick paint will indeed respond to the lighting. So if I am careful and I try to match as closely as possible to the way these things flow and feel, it can really help the whole painting feel like it's part of the same world, a little more photorealistic. I can then play with variations in the lighting and the color of the lighting so that everything responds, everything still feels like it's in the same universe. Textured brushes is a large part of it. In the case of a dressmaker's dummy, we've got a way to go to keep them in line. Another useful tool, especially in a case like this, is using your guides. So I'm going to set up a curved surface that tries to closely match the dressmaker's dummy's surface. So when I go in with these textures, they're a little more likely to stay as close to my surface as possible. And as the lighting changes, it's still fairly convincing that these are part of the same world, that these paints really are on the surface of the dressmaker's dummy. Now, part of the problem comes in is if we're not painting on an existing surface. Even with a guide, some of these textured brushes have holes and gaps in them. So without something behind it, they may not be as convincing as a solid object. One of the things that helps is going in with our hull brushes, making a shape that we can then paint on top of. I'm going to go in with an unlit hull. If I use a standard matte hull with its own highlights and shadows, you'll notice if I put this right behind my object, the textures I'm painting, no matter how careful I am, there's going to be a certain amount of extra shadow and highlight. It's hard to make it convincing that my texture is actually part of that surface. If instead of a matte piece, if instead I use an unlit hull, because the objects aren't casting a shadow, we're not going to see them as separate pieces. However, you'll notice since it doesn't respond to the light, we don't want it to look like we've got it painted on a glowing surface here. So I'm actually going to try to match my color to the darkest shadows on the object. There we go. I'm not going to take the time to match it perfectly, so it's a little more gray. But I'm just going to get close, so I can now make my matte shape closer to that color. So as the highlights and shadows move around, it still feels like it's part of the same object. Now let's make it so it's not overlapping. Whoops. Grab you, pull it back like that. I don't even have to get as close as I do with the other styles. Now as I move it around, because it's very close to the shadow color, it just feels like it's part of the object being overcast by the shadows. So now let's grab that original texture so I can add a few more strokes in here. And even if I change the light source, that hull of the dark shadow fills in the gaps enough so it feels like a much more solid object. We're going to select this whole thing and group it together. So now I can move it around as one piece, and as the shadow changes, it still feels like it's one solid piece. So lighting, texture, and a solid base will help all of these pieces fit together and still be convincing as a real-world object. They're all the same color right now, which looks a little weird, so I can do a little recoloring in here. But now we're getting these uses of different aspects of the painting to help tie everything together, whether it's shadow and highlight, color or solid object inside of it. Whichever tools you use, that's going to help keep this thing together. If you do include things like secondary light sources, I'm going to make a nice little orange fire down here. Do try to make use of the built-in tools to reinforce what people are seeing. So if I'm going to have a fire down here, you can see how having the secondary light source actually can help reflect what the object itself is doing. We're going to bring this closer to the camera and move these light sources around a little bit so you can see how the combination thereof helps all of these objects feel like they're real-world objects. I hope this helps and gives you some ideas. So as you're building paintings, you can choose tools that will help reflect the style of painting you're trying to create. Whether it's a realistic painting or a cartoon, be aware of how the viewer is going to interact and think about how all these tools connect and what the overall painting feels like. Light and texture are the main ingredients for making a painting feel really realistic. Let us know if this helps you. Let us know if you have other questions. We do this all the time here at youtube.com/shamelessmayhem. And we like to answer questions. We like to make episodes based on what you want to learn about. So feel free to use the comments below. I'm going to step in here. I guess we can't. There we go. To block us out so you can read it. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Teaching Tilt Brush.